This here is a motherboard. It is a main component that goes into a PC that hosts a lot of the other components and allows them to work. Though usually when you get a motherboard, it's brand new in the box, or at least it looks like it's in working condition. This one right here, it got pulled out of a dumpster, and it looks like it's got a particular something that came out of a bird. The motherboard in question is a Z87, which supported 4th generation CPUs, and it dates back nearly 7 years, so the motherboard is quite old. And before I get on to cleaning it, I'm actually not going to test it, because testing a motherboard with a certain amount of dirt and debris on it could actually allow that dirt and debris to be capacitive or conductive, and that means that electricity could flow from one component to another where it's not supposed to, and that in itself could be a factor for damaging the motherboard. And also, while we're at it, I found a GTX 660 Ti and also another motherboard, which was an Asus Z97, which is also a 4th generation motherboard. With that aside, let the cleaning begin. If you've just built a gaming PC and you're getting this annoying Windows needs activation message, even on Windows 11, then today's video sponsor can get rid of that message quick and easily for as little as $12 using the coupon code BFTYC. You can save 35% in the month of November. Links in description below. Welcome back to Tech Yes City, and what we're doing right here is we're actually just removing all the heat sinks from these components, because what can happen, especially in the case of this motherboard, the Z87, since it is so dirty, I believe that the dirt has creeped in underneath the heat sink, and that in itself can cause problems, the ones that we described earlier in the intro. However, the final bonus to taking these heat sinks off is that we are going to be able to give this a top to bottom thorough clean. So no part is going to get missed in this upcoming cleanse. And here we are now with the before and after of these computer components. And that first motherboard, that Z87 gigabyte board, is just a completely different motherboard as to what we were looking at the start of the video. It's now looking really clean, and there's still a little bit of water. We'll get onto that soon. But what we can see here is that there was still also a little bit of hardened thermal paste on all three of these components that went through the ultrasonic cleaner. So what I've done now is I've quickly cleaned that off with a microfiber cloth and also a toothpick, as well as on the Intel motherboards. Some of the chipset heatsinks, they can sometimes use some really hard thermal paste on that stuff. So I like to use then a very hard plastic. In this case, we used a USB stick and it did the job great. So that's the initial first phase done. Now for the ultrasonic cleaning, we put these components in at 70 degrees for 15 minutes. If you guys want, I can do a dedicated video on ultrasonic cleaning PC parts from start to finish. But overall, the verdict on the ultrasonic cleaner is that it is one of my favorite tools here in the studio. And it's almost as good as this thing right here, which is what we're going to get onto now, and that's taking all the water off these components, because we don't want any water on there, because that can cause problems just like a massive amount of debris and dirt can. But in this case, we've got here the data vac, and now this has had a tough life. I've had this now for over 3 years, I believe, and it still works. But recently I found this on sale locally here at a store for 99 Aussie dollars. This is called the Big Boy, and it is a lot more powerful than the data vac. I was actually surprised at how much power this thing can pull out. But what I'm doing is I'm just testing it at the moment to make sure that it's okay, it doesn't damage PC parts, because I know the data vac doesn't damage PC parts. So we're gonna give this a whirl, but this thing is so powerful that I actually need earmuffs on in order to operate with it. So we're now gonna put on our earmuffs, and we're gonna get to drying out all the water on the motherboards and the graphics card. And here we are now with the first motherboard. This is the dirty motherboard that we saw at the start of this video. We have now given it the best chance it had, and it's responding with open arms and giving me a hug back and saying, look, Brian, I want to work. Thank you for the tender loving care, aka the tech yes loving. And we've got a signal. This is a board now that, from what I can see, and hopefully, I mean, I've still got to do a full build with it and stress test once I complete a build with it, but this could end up working just like brand new, and it was something that was neglected in a dumpster. Now, I did have to take off the bracket, and I did have to dry off a little bit of water that crept in underneath the actual socket itself, but after we dried that off, we then put that back on, and also did see that 2 pins were misaligned on the socket, so I did bend those back, and then on top of that, I did put a new CMOS battery in, and then I gave it a coat of multi-purpose spray just to protect everything. And this board, honestly, it looks like it's brand new. And from what I can tell, it's hopefully going to then go on to function like brand new too. But anyhow, we've still got 2 more components to get through and test out. So we're going to quickly test out the graphics card. Since we know this motherboard works, we can then substitute the graphics card and see if it gives out a signal quickly. So after spending over an hour and a half with these components, I'm happy to report that we have all 3 of these PC parts that were pulled out of a dumpster, all fully operational, 100% working. This one right here, however, the Z87X Gigabyte board, that was straightforward. That worked with no problems. I filled up the 4 RAM slots. I just updated the BIOS for good measure. That was working fine. But then I put the GTX 660 Ti in that motherboard and it was giving out a B2 error. So I thought maybe the graphics card was faulty, but then I tried that on another system, on my main test system, and it was giving out a signal and it was working fine. So I was a little bit confused, but then I realized back around this era with Gigabyte boards, some of the models they released, especially the UD5 line on X79, on Z87, these had problems supporting some of these newer graphics cards at the time. I know a GTX 660 Ti is ancient now, but at the time it was kind of new and in the scene. So unfortunately, to get around that on the Z87, you have to then use the CPU's onboard graphics, change the UEFI graphics support feature, and then on X79, unfortunately, you will need another graphics card to change this setting because X79 doesn't have onboard graphics. So that's essentially 2 for 2, and we were on a good roll. And then I came into this motherboard right here, the Z97K. This motherboard initially just would give me nothing. I put a speaker on it, it just gave me no signal. It was being very hard to work with. And what happened after that was I decided to try an i3 and a different stick of memory, a 2GB DDR3 stick of memory. And I got a signal out of it. And I was like, whoa, okay, so perhaps this has the potential to work. And then sure enough, I turned it off, turned it on again with the same i3 and the same memory stick, and it would give out no signal. So I eventually messed around with it to the point where I managed to boot it up again, get into the BIOS and update the BIOS. And so after updating the BIOS to the latest version, I then changed it over to an i7-4770S and I filled out the 4 slots of memory. And so I'm happy to report that this board is now fully functional as well. So one thing to keep in mind with the older motherboards is that the BIOSes can become so old and they can essentially suffer from a thing that I believe is known as bit rot. And so over time that can corrupt the motherboard BIOS and cause it not to boot with particular CPUs or particular memory. So if you do manage to get a signal out of it, get into that BIOS, then you can update it and refresh the whole BIOS chip again, extending its life. And now circling back to a conclusion with these dumpster PC parts, I am definitely having a lot of success pulling this stuff out and just cleaning it down and giving it the best chance it has to work again. Now the process here, anyone can do this. I mean, a lot of people laugh at me for washing PC parts in an ultrasonic cleaner and then also bending pins back, but stuff like this can just give you full usage and extend the life of these PC parts that initially got thrown out. Someone didn't want them because for whatever reason, it probably wasn't booting or something in the case of this Z97 here from Asus. Maybe the bit rot crept in on the BIOS chip, caused it not to boot, and so people just chuck out perfectly good hardware that still works. It just needs a little bit of loving, or in this case, tech yes loving. And so for me personally, just getting this stuff and then taking it through the paces and getting it to work again is such a, I don't know, it's exciting. I really enjoy doing this stuff. But also when it comes to things like bending pins, I have actually gotten a lot of experience doing that over time. So it's one of those things that I just jump into now, and it only takes me a couple of minutes max to bend the pins back as good as they could be. And then we've also got, when it comes to cleaning stuff through the ultrasonic cleaner, the water. I know some people cringe at that, but if we look at that Z87X motherboard, the before and after just shows you how effective the ultrasonic cleaner can be when it comes to restoring parts. Now, the final thing to talk about is, of course, when PC parts don't work because a component is missing. So in the case of some of the parts I have at the studio, for instance, I was looking through some of the DDR3 RAM when I was testing this stuff, and it wouldn't boot. So I then looked closer at the DDR3 stick of memory, and that actually has a missing chip on it. So something's fallen off on that chip. And the only way to get that working again would be to solder on a new part. And so when it comes to that kind of stuff, that is the next level of fixing up PC parts. One that once I get a bit of time, I will jump into. I know, because I've got a lot of higher end graphics cards here that are faulty, especially in the case of some of these 1080 Ti's and 980 Ti's. I'd love to get them working again. So I've sort of made this stack of faulty hardware that I think could be fixed if we had replacement parts and a soldering iron. Anyhow, guys, in the meantime, I hope you enjoyed today's before and after transformation. If you did, then be sure to hit that like button. Also, let us know in the comments section below what you think of cleaning up PC parts. What are your preferred methods, and do you like what we were doing here today? Also, there may be some questions about the blower that we were using. It's called the Big Boy, and this thing is so powerful. It's on another level when it comes to the power it has versus the DataVac, which in the field of electronic dusters, the DataVac is already one of the most powerful out there. So this one's actually intended for cars, and that's why I'd pretty much say it's got over double the power of the DataVac. But the problem with me recommending the Big Boy at the moment is that I just don't feel safe. I think that it has the potential to bend pins if you hold the blower too close to the CPU socket. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna test it out on a few older motherboards, especially really cheap ones with perhaps potentially thinner pins. And if it doesn't bend any pins, then I'd be happy to recommend it. But I haven't been too keen to try it on this stuff because I'm trying to get it to work. And if it breaks because of the actual blower itself, and it was a perfectly working part, then I'd be really upset. And so I will test it out on, say, some first generation motherboards that say have i3 550s in them, and they don't support even like an i7 870. So these kind of parts that are really sort of borderline, no one's really going to use them in a gaming PC, I will then check it out on that, and we'll make a dedicated video for that. Because I think with the DataVac, it just went up in price and it became very expensive for a lot of people. So a lot of people have been looking for alternatives, but for me, I'm looking also for an alternative that ultimately is better, because when it came to drying out these parts, this was actually saving me a lot of time. It did a phenomenal job of drying out all that water, which is actually what the Big Boy is intended to do on cars. It's meant to be a final blower to dry off the car. So when I saw what it could do on cars, I was like, well, yeah, this can definitely work on PC parts. And it's actually ironic because a lot of the stuff that I used to do on cars, I found has worked for fixing up PC parts. And if you guys have watched me over the years, you know that I use a lot of car products on PC parts. Anyhow, guys, that's all from me today. I'll catch you in the next one. But before we do, we have the question of the day here, which comes from Leandro. And they ask, is 4x8 gigabytes of HyperX Savage DDR3 for 100 New Zealand dollars a good deal? So I think that's around 95 Aussie dollars, which is a decent deal. It's not the best deal I've seen on RAM, but if you wanted to know if you are not going to get ripped off, then it's not a bad deal either. So I'd say if you need that DDR3 memory, then it's definitely okay to go pick it up at that price. Anyway guys, if you stayed this far and you're enjoying that tech yes content, then you hit that sub button, ring that bell to get the content as soon as it drops, and I'll catch you in another one. Peace out for now. Bye.
We are going to have to act if we want to live in a different world.